Now we're going to head over to Ukraine, in fact.
Yes, we're going to move across to have a look at what's been happening with Ukraine. And of course, the major subject at the moment is tanks, but we will be coming back to medical matters. So this caught my attention this morning. Of course, the BBC for quite a long time has pushed the war in Ukraine to third. If you have a look at the red bar of the BBC website, you can see that home news comes first, then cost of living, and of course people dying in huge numbers in Ukraine. That was pushed down to number 3, but all of a sudden we've now got US and Germany to send tanks to Ukraine, and that's come right up on the first page that you come to. And a couple of hours before we've come live with the news, the headline was updated to this: live, German Chancellor poised to confirm tanks for Ukraine. There is no doubt the BBC regards this as a wonderful war, and they're very keen to get it on the front page when, of course, it's about more weapons from the West into Ukraine. They're not so keen on talking about the poor Ukrainians who are going to die as a result.
So we get the opportunity to put this graphic back on screen one more time. The saga does continue. Hopefully this will be the last time. But anyway, the BBC, when Brian took the screenshot, Olaf Scholz hadn't quite made the statement yet. He has made it now. So let's have a look and see what he said. The goal is to quickly assemble 2 tank battalions with Leopard 2 tanks for Ukraine. In a first step, Germany will provide a company with 14 Leopard 2 A6 tanks from stocks of the Bundeswehr. Do you think it's a coincidence that he's providing 14?
No, I think this is a very, very strong political statement that the Germans don't really want to do this. I believe there's a huge backlash actually under the surface in Germany, because it was Nazi German tank armies that killed millions of people in the Soviet Union. And I think there are many German people who do not want to do this. So parity with the UK numbers was sort of the minimum they could get away with. And I think this is a statement that they are not going to escalate it with more than 14 tanks.
Right. So let's move on with what he said. Other European partners will hand over Leopard 2 tanks. The training of the Ukrainian crews should begin quickly in Germany. In addition to training, the package will also include logistics, ammunition, and maintenance of the systems. Now, Patrick was talking about this on Friday's program, Brian, about the fact that, of course, there's no possibility of training Ukrainians to maintain these tanks, either the British or the German tanks. Therefore, we're going to have to send British personnel, and the Germans or the Polish are going to have to send German and Polish personnel to maintain these tanks. That's NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine.
Well, this is escalation. We are gradually, slowly but surely, we are being drawn into direct confrontation with the Russians. And this is what I think many people don't understand. A lot of the surveillance being done by NATO is being done remotely. But if you want to support these type of vehicles and have them fighting on the front lines, then you've got to have the fully qualified maintenance and backup teams. And where are you going to put those? They've got to go into Ukraine. So this is NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine coming up.
Now, of course, as Brian said, lots of opposition to this in Germany, but not everywhere. Here is Katrin Göring Eckardt, who is the vice president of the Bundestag. The Leopards freed, and with an exclamation mark. Alex, very happy that the tanks are going.
Oh, there are certainly Atlanticist people. Göring Eckardt of the Greens is a well-known example, who are very keen on this. And at national level too, there are certain governments which are keen to be seen as hawks. I have a NATO source who tells me that Mr. Reznikov, the Ukrainian foreign minister, came very smugly, grinning from ear to ear, out of a secret conclave held in the margins of the Ramstein meeting on Friday. That's the 50 defense ministers meeting in a Ukraine support conclave, as you've reported on Friday. The Ramstein ministers had a hiving off, and some of the ministers, I don't know whether the German defense minister was among them, but I'm pretty sure they would have been, went into conclave in a secret session, and Reznikov came out beaming and saying to guilt trip the other defense ministers, "You can hear the leopards roaring in that room." So yes, there are some cheerleaders, and Göring Eckardt is particularly interesting because her party background is supposed to be peacenik. And yet, as we've reported at state level as well, with the coal digging in North Rhine-Westphalia, the Greens are now having to take decisions diametrically opposed to their manifesto commitments over the decades.
Yes. Now, the United States so far hasn't made any formal notification that they're going to be doing the same, but they're expected to send 30 tanks is what is expected from the US. But is it going to end with tanks? Well, according to Colonel Yuri Ihnat, from spokesperson for the Ukrainian Air Force, absolutely not. He's talking about aircraft, and the decisions have already been made about which types of aircraft and how many aircraft and support and so on. And he's saying the type of aircraft that will likely be provided to Ukraine and the corresponding terms of personnel training have already been determined. So, Alex, my question is, what happens on the battlefront once if the West does send Ukraine aircraft? Because to my knowledge, Russia is not waging any major aerial campaign at this point. They're bombing with and they're heavy shelling and so on, but not from aircraft. So if NATO supplied aircraft start flying in Ukrainian skies, that's going to encourage Russia or they're going to have to respond to that. This again is escalation.
Definitely, and in my limited experience of this from being a sideline viewer of the strategic air and tactical air efforts, which were joint Royal Air Force, Army and Civilian at GCHQ and NSA, I was in awe of how seriously they took their job, and also in awe of just how committed the Russian airmen are to their mission, as was well acknowledged by the West. And so they're not going to take this lightly. They have, I think even sort of enlightened laymen know this, spectacularly good air defense and radar coverage. They don't like their territory being infringed by a foot. They're not going to leave it lying. It has been a big debate, hasn't it, for the first year of this horrible war. Why aren't the Russians responding from the air? The dominant reason given back, other than not wanting World War III, is that it's thought on behalf of the Russians that they don't want to display their airframes and the capacities they have. But I think there will be many ground-based ways as well as air-based ways of responding to this escalation. And this is probably a good moment to insert as well what the other thing is that a NATO source told me from the last week, which is that the NATO Policy Planners Conference took place in Paris on the 17th and 18th of this month. Not much was said publicly about it. The press release will be in the show notes. Sweden and Finland were represented as supposedly imminent members, although Sweden may now be left behind after a Koran burning incident outside an embassy, leaving Gotland very exposed in the Baltic. But they discussed the medium-term policy challenges for Russia's war and the future of the transatlantic security order. They discussed internal instability and what they called threats to democracy arising from these international disorders. The source reports that there were chucklesome moments, such as when the defense ministers and policy planners discussed the possible alternative futures of Russia, the sudden disappearance of Putin, and apparently some participants said, well, what happens if there's a sudden disappearance of Zelensky? Why isn't that on the agenda? Quite telling. And another thing they considered was a highly isolated and aggressive Russia scenario and a domestic instability and political chaos in Russia scenario, including nuclear risks. The one thing that they didn't seem to be discussing there was what you raised, which is the overwhelming force of Russian air operating in its own airspace and just beyond to put paid to, I think, almost anything the West can put in the battlefield.
Yes, thank you for that, Alex. The other thing to add to the mix that you've described there is Russian electronic warfare, which is proving to be devastating to the Western and Ukrainian forces on the battlefield, and much of their equipment still hasn't been brought into theatre. So a combination of Russian air defence missiles and air-launched air defence missiles, plus that electronic warfare, are the two things at the moment which are absolutely dominating the battle. But of course, if we go by the number of tanks that we're talking about, putting in a few more aircraft from the West aren't going to make any difference. They're going to be shot down along with the other Ukrainian aircraft, the remaining small numbers, which are still shot down on a regular basis, week by week, month by month. But we are being slowly but surely pulled towards a direct conflict with Russia, and it seems to me that the Biden administration now is just reinforcing its own